What happens when gamers can't consent to games? Video games are often likened to drug use, both colloquially by reviewers who can call gameplay addictive and by clinical psychologists who study addiction. However, you have likely heard another term thrown around when discussing people forming an unhealthy dependence on gaming: compulsion. What's the difference between an addiction and a compulsion? As a subjective, lived experience by an individual? Very little, actually. As explained in Addiction by Design by Natasha Dow-Schul, those who have developed a compulsion tend to experience similar levels of anxiety and dysfunction in the absence of their focus. Engaging with that focus at some point stops being a matter of fulfillment, enjoyment, or purpose, and instead becomes the sole way a person reaches a state of calm or normalcy. So if the subjective experience of a compulsion is largely the same, is calling one thing an addiction and the other a compulsion essentially making a distinction without a difference? Not quite. There are two major differences: chemistry and psychology. First, addictions are reactions to chemicals external to the human body being introduced to the human body. Many chemicals, not even just the illegal drugs we typically associate with addiction, have clearly defined chains of cause and effect that can be observed and tracked. The amount of time it takes for a drug's effect to begin, the duration of the high, the amount of use necessary to create the onset of addiction, and the different kinds of withdrawal symptoms and their durations can all be documented. These aren't merely based on habits or stress, the anxiety-motivated behaviors. These are biological changes to the body that do not occur if not for the use of a specific drug. To highlight the difference between addiction and compulsive habituation, we can even highlight some drugs that are addictive before they have an opportunity to become compulsive. A popular legal and over-the-counter drug, oxymetazoline hydrochloride, known to most by the brand name Afrin, is a highly addictive decongestant. Using Afrin more frequently than once every 12 hours or for longer than 3 days will almost invariably result in an addiction in most people. Withdrawal from oxymetazoline hydrochloride involves mainly the ironic symptom of extreme nasal congestion, which can last from 3 days up to 3 months and more, depending on the severity and duration of the prolonged use. Given that the standard effect of the drug's own withdrawal symptom is to cure the symptom, thousands of people get addicted to Afrin because they overtreat a particularly bad sinus infection or use it instead of allergy medication to manage seasonal allergies. You can actually force upon yourself a legally available addiction in a single day, whereas many psychologists recognize that it takes around 10 to 30 days of doing an activity consistently to form a habit. Other addictions without habits happen all the time. Patients in hospitals get addicted to opioids even when using standard dosing for pain treatments. Babies in the womb can become addicted to amphetamines if the parent is using. Children can become addicted to nicotine from secondhand smoke. Socially acceptable drugs like alcohol and caffeine have a certain quantifiable addictive quality as well. You may be born with a predisposition or have a family history of addiction to alcohol or caffeine, and thus be more likely to experience addiction, where most people will manage their consumption in a way that never has a negative impact on their life and livelihood. And that's an important point to keep in mind for later. Treatment facilities often have to stock illegal drugs in order to properly treat a person coming off of an addiction, because withdrawal symptoms from certain substances can result in cardiac arrest, panic attacks, severe hallucinations, and death. Cold turkey is sometimes a death sentence. Coming off of a severe compulsion can have similar experiences of withdrawal related to stress and anxiety. Coming off of a compulsion can result in panic attacks and violent outbursts, loss of inhibition, and much more. I am not downplaying the severity of what a compulsion can do to a person in any way. Let me emphasize that. It's bad. However, from a medical perspective, if medical professionals and researchers cannot treat these categories interchangeably, then neither should we. From both a pragmatic and ontological perspective, we must remember there is an important difference. Second, compulsions are internal reactions to an extremely broad array of objects or activities that are their focus. Anything that is in any way pleasurable, meaningful, or relaxing has the potential to become habituated, and from habit to become a compulsion that is deleterious to a person's health if it causes a release of dopamine, adrenaline, oxytocin, serotonin, testosterone, or estrogen. Then the behavior or activity contains within it the possibility of becoming the focus of a compulsion. To list a few that aren't video games: shopping, tasty food, exercise, sex and masturbation, work, being angry, self-harm, sleep. The list goes on. Some drugs are proven to be non-addictive, and yet one can still develop a compulsive dependence on its use. The main example in modern times to be THC, or as it's known in common parlance, icky, sticky, dank, ash, cushy, chronic goodness. Video games, both as new media and for its specific focus on being designed for engagement as a core goal, have become a major place of scrutiny for examining the concept of compulsion, though what is compulsive and how seriously society takes it vary drastically by era and region. Once it was Pac-Man and Tetris in the corner of local pubs, the social obsession with these games being international sensations treated more like musical one-hit wonders rather than anything external to a cultural norm. Then arcades as a business model garnered a reputation for delinquency in adults and truancy in children and teens. Before the language of compulsion, gaming was associated with the shirking of responsibility and the corruption of the youth, much like philosophy. Then we have the rise of the MMORPG in the 2000s, stoking the fear that an entire generation will become socially isolated invalids, in particular becoming far more prevalent in South Korea, which led the zeitgeist of studies into video game addiction, what we now call compulsion, for years. In Japan, the rise of hikikomori, a particularly media-focused form of agoraphobia, is a modern social illness on the rise. People mainly focusing on blaming sexual gratification in anime and games as causing the rising rates of hikikomori and lowering the birth rate, rather than seeing the rise of agoraphobia as a symptom of a broader systemic problem that also gravitates towards media consumption as a part of those symptoms. Despite the extra attention, games are not categorically different from the perspective of forming compulsions than other activities. Some activities can be more or less likely, depending on the person engaging in the activity, to develop into a compulsion. Some games will be more compulsive than others. Games may even specifically design themselves to take advantage of habituation strategies developed by psychologists. Yet it can be important to remember that even in the absence of such an intent, one can develop compulsions focused on simply good games like Minesweeper, Tetris, Pac-Man, and Bubsy 3D. Once a compulsion is established, it can be an active detriment to a person's life, health, and livelihood. Quitting a compulsion can result in a wide array of reactions as well. Essentially, any behavior or health condition associated with extremely high levels of stress can manifest while kicking a compulsion. Gradually separating from a compulsion often isn't an option because it is habit-based, and any engagement with the habit reinforces the compulsion. compulsion, quitting cold turkey, while torturous, can often be accomplished by having a strong network of support from friends and loved ones, a predetermined behavior plan, and counseling from a licensed professional therapist that the person relates to or can open up to. There is research enough to safely conclude that once a person has a compulsion, willpower and decision-making are often not an option. People experiencing a compulsion will use extensive motivated reasoning to maintain their compulsion even as it negatively impacts their life. At this point, consent is out of the question, and we reach a new question. Whose duty is it to protect people from compulsions? And how do we protect people from compulsions? Much like with drug use, painting any broad category as inherently bad creates an unnecessary demonization of very normal experiences of enjoyment and engagement for most people. For example, it is overly broad to attempt to define the concept of extrinsically rewarding gameplay as compulsive by nature when both intrinsic and extrinsic reward systems can result in compulsion. Same too with defining any game loop in a design theory as compulsive while reserving the non-compulsiveness quality for anything within a game that diverges from a core experience, regardless of how repetitive that core experience may be. Compulsions come from within us, within our body. Thus, we may not haphazardly externalize blame for a compulsion onto an object. Due to the broad nature of what a compulsion can form around, it would be absurd to burden game developers with never making a game that could potentially become someone's compulsion. Given that compulsions arise out of typically pleasurable activities, to ban those activities to protect a smaller subset of people predisposed to forming a compulsion means to violate the liberty of those without compulsions to consent to a risk or pursue a self-determined value. Just because some people form an addiction to caffeine or alcohol does not mean no one should be allowed to have coffee and wine. Nor should we try to establish a pejorative or moral judgment to the production or consumption of these beverages. The same can be said of game mechanics and systems that are disproportionately pleasurable to people who are neurodivergent. To give a pejorative quality toward a kind of game that most people can play responsibly is unfair. There is by necessity some personal responsibility involved in knowing yourself and taking steps to avoid that which is uniquely harmful to yourself. Essentially, the conclusion that we can draw here is that no widely categorical restriction can be created because of the extremely broad nature of what can become a compulsion. Does that mean there is nothing we can do to protect people from being taken advantage of by predatory actors seeking to profit off of people who have lost their agency to the illness of compulsion? I don't think so. We can do plenty. It simply needs to be targeted and specific to the practice, identifying when a design or practice is specifically targeting neurodivergent people and attempting to create compulsion to be abused, as opposed to just trying to make a good game with a specific kind of play or a pleasing aesthetic. I am in no way educated enough to call for specific policy changes to regulate video game sales. However, here are some examples of making specifically targeted requirements. Identifying and banning Skinner box reward structures, requiring account limits for spending on microtransactions. Banning loot boxes outright. Countries are actually doing that. Or requiring developers to remind players to take breaks at certain intervals of time played. Are these good ideas? I don't know. I haven't really formed an opinion on them. Do such requirements unnecessarily harm the artistic expression of a developer? Or do they merely block abusive capitalistic monetization? It could be both. Yes to both, maybe. These are questions you will need to form your own opinions on. Some games that use similar designs that can be deemed higher risk for neurodivergent people can act as less harmful alternatives and keep neurodivergent people away from predatory actors, or could be used to wean a person off of an established compulsion, thus, like a treatment center holding stock of illegal drugs to manage withdrawal. Some games that are categorically identical with games designed to exploit compulsion may in fact be safeguards against developers with abusive intent. Even with a specific policy approach, we must also be careful not to tie our own hands. Yet, in asking about specific design choices, another question comes to mind outside of psychological tricks and manipulation. For so long, game design philosophy has taken the flow state as an inherently desirable goal. Yet, we have seen here that psychological flow has an intimate relationship to the dynamics of a compulsion. Thus, our next question to tackle is flow harmful game design? We'll answer that question next time. Stay true.